Awesome. Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Icon. So glad that you're here with us today. For those of you guys who don't know me, my name is Steve, and I'm one of the pastors on the team here. And again, just excited to be with you as we continue our series, Fresh from the Garden. Now, if you missed any of the last few weeks as we've been in this series, I would highly encourage you to jump online, check out the podcast. We've got all the sermons up there for you to download or for you to listen on your way to work or whatever. So check this out. It's been a really fun series. And what we've been doing in this series is we've actually been exploring the fruits of the Spirit. Now, if you're not familiar with what that is, and that's like a weird term to you, that's okay. What it means is it's actually a term that comes out of Galatians. And the Apostle Paul used this term, fruits of the Spirit, to describe what our lives should look like when we follow Jesus. In other words, as we become more and more like Jesus, here's the characteristics that our lives should begin to take on. And so we've been exploring some of these during this series on Sunday. And today, we're going to continue that, and today we're going to talk about peace, all right? We're looking at peace, the fruit of the Spirit, peace, and we're going to explore what does peace look like for us as followers of Christ, and then we're going to explore how do we get more of it, okay? Because I don't know about you, but if there's an option to get more peace or less peace, I like the more peace option, okay? So that's where we're going today. We're going to explore peace and look at that. And this is a subject that, quite frankly, I feel like I've been learning a lot about recently since we had our son Davis. I've been learning a lot about peace, okay? And for those of you who don't know, my son Davis was born about 4 months ago. My wife and I, it's our first son. And so we've been learning a lot. And, you know, before you have kids, you sort of have these, kind of irrational fears or kind of nervousness about what it's going to be like when you have your kid. I don't know if I'm the only one. But one of those fears that I had that was maybe a little bit irrational was this is going to sound a little weird, but I had a fear, you could say, of holding babies, okay? I'm just being honest in here, okay? We're in church. I'm just going to be honest. I know it's a little strange, but it terrified me to hold babies, right? And it's not because I was afraid that I was gonna hold the baby wrong and drop the kid or whatever. We've all dropped babies. They're fine. They're resilient. There's nothing to worry about. It's fine. I wasn't worried about that, right? It was totally fine. But I was nervous holding kids because what happens inevitably is you're hanging out with a group of your friends, right? And everything's going great. Maybe you're at the party or you're kind of at your small group or whatever, and in walks the new parents, right? And you can always tell they're new parents because they look completely exhausted and sleep deprived. Trust me, this has been my world the last few months. And you can also tell they're new parents because they usually are holding a small human with them. So it's they're probably parents, unless they stole that child. So it's another sermon, But there they are, right? And they walk in, and inevitably what happens at some point in the night is you're all hanging out, and at some point, one of the new parents comes up to you with the baby, and they ask you that fateful sort of no-win question that usually goes something like this, hey, would you like to hold the baby, right? Now, that seems innocent enough at first. I get it, okay? It seems innocent until you realize this is a loaded question, okay? This is the equivalent of your wife walking up to you and asking you if she looks fat in that dress, right? There's no right answer, okay? You're set up to lose. When your wife asks you that question, you might as well go ahead and grab the extra pillow and comforter and make your way to the couch because there's no right answer. And this is the same, because if someone asks you, do you want to hold the baby, and you say no, well, now all of a sudden you're that jerk who hates kids, right? You're like, what? And the parents, they look at you with this kind of look of disgust, and they're like, oh, so you're too good to hold my baby, huh? You're too good to hold my little angel here, right? So if you say no, you don't really win. But if you say yes, well, now all of a sudden you have to hold this child. And you have to pray to God that this child does not start crying, okay? Have you been there, right? Because you have to... We've been there. You take the baby, you hold it, you're bouncing the baby like they say to do in the book and on the movie, right? You're doing everything you're supposed to do when all of a sudden it happens every single time. It seems like the baby out of nowhere just starts screaming. You're like, what is the matter? Why is this baby crying? I'm doing everything. It's like this baby just got possessed by a demon, right? And you're sitting there I don't know what to do. And then what happens is the whole party, everyone there stops and they all turn and look right at you, right? Not the baby. No one's looking at the baby. They're looking at you with those little judgmental eyes, right? And they're all thinking the exact same thing. They're thinking, what did you do to this baby, right? Because a few minutes ago, this baby was fine, but now all of a sudden you're holding the baby and the baby's not fine. And it was happy before, but now it's not. And why doesn't the baby like you, right? And as you sit there with this screaming child, not knowing what to do, all of a sudden it's like every insecurity that you've ever dealt with in your entire life just rises back to the surface. And you're like, well, why doesn't this baby like me? Why doesn't anyone like me? Am I going to be single for the rest of my God-forsaken life? Like, why is this happening, right? And it's all because you held your friend's baby. I'm telling you, holding friends' babies is dangerous, okay? So needless to say, when we had Davis, I was a little bit nervous about holding kids because I'd spent like the last 5 years coming up with excuses on why I can't hold my friends' kids, right? They'd ask me and I'd be like, oh, gosh, I'd love to hold your kid, but just not feeling real good. They're like, oh, really? What's the matter? That's a good question. I think I probably have the flu. Might be the swine flu. I hear it's making a comeback. Super contagious. You probably shouldn't hold the baby, right? Like that's been my world. And then we had Davis. And those excuses didn't work on my wife. And she said, you're going to hold your son. And so I did. And what I learned through having Davis and obviously spending a lot of time with him, I learned something really profound that I think we'll all agree is life-changing. But this is what I learned, is that sometimes babies, they just cry, right? Like sometimes they just cry for no reason at all. Okay? Now, yes, there are times when the baby is crying because the baby's hungry, and so you feed the baby, and everything's fine. There are times when the baby maybe has a dirty diaper, so you change the diaper, right? There are times when the baby is just tired, and that's why the baby's crying, and so you just, you need to put the baby to bed. There are times when you're just tired, and so you need to put a little NyQuil in the baby's bottle, and then everything just gets better after that. Trust me, there's no judgment here. I get it. Right? But sometimes babies, they just cry, okay? For no reason. It's not because they need something. It's not because you did something wrong. It's not because you're a terrible human. It's just that sometimes babies just cry. And this morning, as we talk about peace, and we dive into this in the same way, what I've discovered over the years is that sometimes life just happens, doesn't it? Like sometimes life just happens. Things don't go according to plan, right? Sometimes bad things happen to good people. Sometimes you and I, we face circumstances and stresses and anxieties that just can feel just overwhelming. And it's not because you did anything wrong. It's not because you're a bad person. It's because sometimes life just happens. And the question we're going to explore today is, how do you respond in those moments when life just happens? How do you have peace in those moments? The moments when you get that bill in the mail and you're looking at the bill and you're looking at what's in your checking account and you're doing the math and it's just not adding up. And you're thinking, I don't know how we're going to pay this bill. We don't have enough money. I don't know how we're going to make it through another month. And you're just stressed out. How do you respond in those moments when you have that assignment that's due at school or it's due at your work and you're looking at all the things that you have to do and you're looking at all the hours in your day and you're thinking, I don't know how I'm going to get it done in time the way it needs to get done, and you're in this process and it just feels overwhelming? Or what about those moments when you get that call from the school and your kid is in trouble again, and you're sitting on the other line of this phone call and you're thinking to yourself, like, I don't know what else to do. We've already tried everything. We've talked to him, we've disciplined, and you just feel overwhelmed. Or what about the moment when you're sitting across from the doctor and the test results come in and the doctor looks at you and he says, they came back positive. And all of a sudden, it's like in that moment, your whole world just got flipped upside down. And all of a sudden, everything just changed in an instant. Because you said, I wasn't supposed to have this diagnosis. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. And how do you respond to those moments? Or the moment when maybe you meet with your boss and your boss looks at you and says, hey, our company hasn't been performing, hasn't been hitting the sales marks we needed, and unfortunately we're having to downsize and we're going to have to lay you off. And you're sitting on the other side of that and you're just thinking in your mind, like, is this really happening? Like, is this real life? And all of a sudden a million thoughts and worries and fears start coming to your mind because you're like, how am I going to take care of my family? Am I going to be able to get another job? And you just feel overwhelmed. Because sometimes life just happens. You didn't plan for it. You didn't ask for it. But nonetheless, you're in the middle of it. I remember I had a moment like this several years ago when life just kind of happened. I remember it was my freshman year of college, and I was going to Bible school. And I remember it was a season when, quite frankly, I was loving life. Like, things were just going awesome. Like, I remember it was the first time that I'd been out of the house. I just graduated high school the year before. It was the first time that I'd moved, and I have my own dorm and roommates. In fact, Adam White, some of you guys know him. He was my roommate when I went to Bible school. So everything other than that was awesome. But, you can't have it all, but you do what you can. But I was loving life, right? Like, I was on my own. Things were going great. Like, I was at this ministry school. I was learning about ministry. That's what I wanted to do. I just remember things were going great. And I remember this one day in particular. It was a Tuesday in March, and we were in the spring semester, and it was a normal day. I remember I started out, and I woke up, and I made breakfast, and I did some devotions where I prayed and read the Bible. I went to class, and I remember at lunchtime, I came home, and I was talking to another one of my roommates, a guy named Nick, and we were talking. He's saying, "Hey, did you see Katie and Wendy this morning?" And I remember thinking, like, I was talking to him, Katie and Wendy, they were just a couple of our friends in our class, and I remember saying, no, I didn't see them this morning. I didn't see them at class. And he's like, yeah, they must have skipped. That's the weirdest thing. We were kind of joking about it because, they didn't skip class that much, and we just thought, I probably just slept in, no big deal. So we went on with the day, and I remember that afternoon I went and I served downtown doing this community service thing, and I did that, and I came home that afternoon/night, and I remember I was getting ready to make dinner. And I started getting stuff out of the refrigerator when I got this text message. And it said, hey, we need all of the students and staff of this Bible school room. We need everyone to come in for a special meeting. And we need you to come in like an hour. Now, it was a small school, so you could pull everybody in. But I remember it was definitely out of the ordinary. And I was like, man, that's so random. That's so weird. I didn't really know what was going on, so I put dinner on hold. I remember I got my car, I drove over to the church where we had classes at, and we sat in this room, and everybody came, all the students, all the staff, and we were all sitting there waiting for this meeting to get started. And I remember all of us were kind of sitting there. Everyone was kind of quiet because no one really knew what we were doing there. Like, we had no idea, and we were all kind of sitting there like, what is going on? Like, why are we meeting? And I'll never forget, I remember the pastor walked into the room, the guy that was leading the school, he walked in the back of the room. When he walked in, it was like everyone was dead silent because we were all just waiting with anticipation, like, what is going on? And I remember he walked right up to the stage, and he got up on stage. You could have heard a pin drop in the room. I mean, it was silent. I remember he looked at us and he said, there's really no easy way to say this, so I'm just going to say it. And I'll never forget the words that he said next because they're forever burned in my memory when he looked at us and he said, Katie Prosapio and Wendy Watson were killed in a car accident this morning. And I don't even remember what he said next. I just remember being totally floored and totally shocked that two of my friends who I just hung out with, like, they all of a sudden he's telling me they were gone. I don't remember what he said next. It was all a blur. I just remember in that moment thinking, like, what is going on? And it was like just this shockwave. And I remember hearing my friends just cry, and some were screaming, and it was this moment we were all just totally floored at hearing that our two friends were gone. And I remember sitting there in that room and just not knowing what to think, not knowing what to do. It was like my mind was skipping a beat. I didn't know how to process this. I'd never processed anything like this before. Because you have to understand, these weren't just some random people. I mean, these were our friends. I remember literally, like Wendy was in my small group. Like, the night before, we had just hung out. Like, we were later on that year, we were supposed to go on a missions trip together. Katie, she was in my class. Like we went to class here. Literally the next morning, we were supposed to be on the same team to go downtown, and we were going to go help at this soup kitchen like the next day. And now all of a sudden you're telling me that they're gone forever. And I remember sitting there, and we sat in that room what seemed like for hours and hours, and we talked, and we cried, and we grieved, and we mourned, and it was a Tuesday night, and I'll never forget it. Fast forward a few days, I remember that Saturday, we went to 2 funerals in one day. No one should ever have to go to 2 funerals in one day. And I remember at the second funeral, I was one of the pallbearers. After we got done with the funeral, just being just totally emotionally exhausted, just completely spent spiritually, physically, like I was just done. And I remember thinking to myself, like, I don't know how to handle this. Like, this wasn't supposed to happen. I don't have a category for this. Because at this point, you have to understand, I'd only been following Jesus for, a couple of years, maybe, a year and a half. And I had always thought that when you follow Jesus, like, everything was supposed to be okay. Like, it wasn't supposed to be like this. I'd always heard pastors, they stood up on a stage like this, and they would tell me, if you follow Jesus, he's going to make your life better. If you follow Jesus, he's going to give you life and life to the full. In other words, they would tell me, you're going to have the best life possible, a life full of joy and peace. And I remember on that Saturday, after that second funeral, sitting there and thinking, this doesn't feel like peace to me. This doesn't feel like the best life possible to me. And I remember sitting there and just thinking, like, this isn't supposed to be like this. And yet there I was, because I always thought that when you follow Jesus, like, he's going to make my life better and he's going to give me peace. And I don't know, I thought that peace meant that my life would be peaceful, right? Like, that's what I had thought. Like, that meant that things were supposed to work out. That I was supposed to be happy, that things were supposed to go great, that life would be awesome. That's what I thought the deal was. And then all of a sudden, on a Tuesday in March, everything wasn't awesome anymore. And everything changed, and all of a sudden, all my nice, neat little categories for what it meant to have faith, all those started to break down. All my neat little categories for what peace was supposed to look like started to break down when my life collided with tragedy. And it was through this season of grieving and mourning and processing the death of my 2 friends that I realized that I needed a new understanding of what it meant to have peace. Because the definition that I had just didn't stand up to reality. And so I started to look in the scriptures. And what's interesting is that if you look in the scriptures, you see a very different picture of peace than what I had originally thought. In fact, there's one story that comes to mind that gives us a really interesting picture of what peace looks like for us as followers of Christ. And it's a story with Jesus and his disciples. And it's a story that, just like me, they encountered a circumstance that they didn't expect. They encountered something that they weren't planning for when life just sort of happened. And it comes out of Mark chapter 4. And what happened was the disciples had followed Jesus. And they dropped everything they had to follow Jesus, and life was going great, right? Like Jesus was doing these teachings, and all these crowds were coming, and people from all over were coming to see Jesus, and disciples were part of it, and Jesus was doing all these miracles, and things were going great. Well, it was right after Jesus had just done a teaching like he always did, and then he made this suggestion in Mark chapter 4 where he said this. It says this in verse 35. It says, as evening came, Jesus said to his disciples, let's cross to the other side of the lake. And so they took Jesus in the boat, and they started out, leaving the crowds behind. But soon a fierce storm came up. Now, before we go to the next verse, it's interesting because here Jesus is, and he's got all his disciples, and things are going great, and life is going awesome. And all of a sudden, Jesus makes this suggestion. He says, hey, let's go to the other side of the lake. When all of a sudden it says, out of nowhere, a fierce storm came up. And isn't that how it tends to happen for you and I? Things are going great. Work's going awesome. Kids are doing good. A life, couldn't ask for a better life. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, life just happens. A storm comes. You lose your job. You get a phone call that your friend is having that issue. You're hitting a rocky point in your marriage, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, a storm comes. You didn't plan for it, you didn't want it, you didn't ask for it, but you find yourself in the middle of a storm, and that's where the disciples found themselves. And it says this in the next verse, it says that high waves were breaking into the boat, and it began to fill with water. Now, I'm no expert on boats or anything really, but I'm pretty sure that the idea is you keep the water outside of the boat, right? Like when the boat starts to fill with water, you have a problem, right? And the disciples, they're in this storm and things are getting so bad that the boat is actually beginning to fill with water. And in the middle of all of this chaos, where do we find Jesus? It says this in the next verse. Jesus was sleeping at the back of the boat with his head on a cushion. You ever felt like Jesus was asleep on the job? You ever felt like you're in the middle of the storm and life just threw you a curveball and you're sitting there and you're thinking, God, where are you in all of this? Right? Like, what's going on? Don't you care? That's exactly how the disciples felt, because you see in the next verse it says this, and in verse 37 it says, the disciples woke him up shouting, "Teacher, don't you care that we're going to drown?" I mean, you can almost hear the fear and the frustration in their voices as they're in the middle of the storm and they're just freaking out. And here's Jesus is asleep. And they're like, Jesus, what are you doing? What is happening? Jesus, we dropped everything to follow you. We did our end of the deal. We're here. We're following you. And you said you were supposed to give us a better life. Jesus, what is going on? Like, why are we in the middle of the storm? Why is this happening? It's almost as if the disciples that day had the same kind of definition of peace that I did, where they thought, Jesus, I'm not supposed to have problems because we're following you. We're not supposed to have pain, Jesus, because we're with you. We're not supposed to face storms, Jesus, because we said we would follow you and we kept our end of the deal, and now it's your turn to keep your end of the deal. Of course, the irony is that though the disciples, they followed Jesus, oftentimes they weren't really good at listening to what Jesus was actually saying, because several times if you read the Gospels, you'll see the disciples just, they didn't get it, and Jesus had to repeat himself over and over. And what you see when you look in the scriptures is Jesus never actually promised that we'd have an easy life. He didn't promise that. He didn't promise that we'd have a pain-free life. In fact, I want to show you a verse in John. This is Jesus talking, and this is what he promises. In John chapter 16, it says this. He says, I've told you these things so that in me you may have peace. Because in this world you will have trouble. But take heart, for I have overcome the world. See, in this verse, Jesus makes a couple of promises. And one of those promises we don't like to talk about very much because it's not a very sexy promise. Right? Like, this isn't a promise that's really fun. But he makes this promise. He says this. He says, in this world, you will have trouble. He says, guys, listen, we live in a fallen world. And in this world, guess what? Things aren't always going to go according to plan. You will have moments where you experience pain. You will have moments where you experience loss. You will have moments where you experience frustration. You will have moments where you experience trouble. He says, listen, you're going to face storms. This is a promise. But thankfully for you and I, he doesn't stop there. And he says, hey, listen, take heart because I've overcome the world. And he says, in me, you can have peace. See, in this verse, Jesus makes an incredibly important distinction when it talks about what it looks like for you and I to have peace. And if we're ever going to have the kind of peace that Jesus wants to give us, the kind of peace that's bigger than what we can even wrap our heads around, if we're ever going to tap into that kind of peace, it is so vital that we understand what Jesus is saying in this verse, what he tells us, the kind of peace that we can have, because this is the essence of what Jesus is saying, and I want you guys to get this. Write this down. It says, here's what he's saying. He's saying, peace isn't the absence of problems, but rather the presence of God. You got to get this. Peace isn't the absence of problems, but the presence of God. In other words, peace doesn't mean that I live a life that's problem-free. Peace doesn't mean that everything goes according to plan 100% of the time. Peace doesn't mean that it's always sunny outside, right? Like, that's not what Jesus told us. Jesus said, no, You're going to have problems. Things aren't going to go according to plan. You're going to have hardships. You're going to have trouble. Things are going to go wrong. He says that, but yet at the same time, you can have peace even in the middle of that. That even though you may have curveballs thrown your way, even though you may have seasons of pain and trial and turbulence, you can have peace in spite of that, in the middle of that, because you can have peace in me. In me. In the middle of the storm, in the middle of the trial, in the middle of the tragedy, you can still have peace, because peace isn't the absence of problems, but the presence of God. In other words, when God is with us, when he is in the middle of our storm, something significant happens when we say, God, I'm going to invite you into the middle of this chaos, into the middle of this storm. I'm going to invite your presence because I can't do this on my own, right? This is an important distinction. Peace doesn't mean that we don't face storms. It means we don't have to face the storms alone anymore. And it changes everything. It changes everything when we realize that we have a God who is for us and who is with us. And when we invite him into that moment, when we invite his presence in, all of a sudden he starts to instill a peace in us that surpasses understanding. You know, I've always loved this picture in the story of Jesus asleep in the middle of a storm. I've always loved this picture because here you have all this chaos and craziness. You have waves crashing in, you have thunder and lightning, and the disciples are going crazy. And yet, in the middle of all of that, we have Jesus peacefully asleep. Which to me begs the question of why was Jesus able to be at peace when the disciples weren't, right? Because the interesting thing is you have the disciples and Jesus, they're in the same boat, right? They're in the same storm. They're facing the exact same circumstances, yet they had very, very different responses. And what was it that Jesus understood that they missed? And what I think it was, when we look at the context of this whole story, is that Jesus understood who was really in control. And it changed everything. In fact, look at this last verse here in the passage here. This is what Jesus' response was. It says, when Jesus woke up, he rebuked the wind and said to the waves, silence, be still. And suddenly the wind stopped and there was a great calm. See, I love this because we serve a God who not only wants to be present with us in the middle of our trials, who not only wants to be present with us in the middle of our problems, who not only wants to be there for us and be there with us and give us his presence, but we serve a God who can speak to the winds and the waves, and the winds and the waves have to obey. Okay, what that means is we serve a God who can speak to your circumstances, who has the power to change your circumstances, who has the power to bring hope and bring a solution when it seems like there's no solution. We serve a God who is the one who is really in control. And if you want to have peace, you have to get this. This is critical. We find peace when we remember who is in control, who's really in control. And something incredibly comforting happens when we remember who's in control. When we remember that we serve a God who still holds the whole world in his hands. When we remember that we serve a God who has the power to do anything, that nothing is impossible with him. That's what the scriptures say. There's no obstacle that's too big for him to overcome. There's no person that's too far outside of his reach for God to capture, right? Like we serve that kind of God, the God who is in control, that he speaks to the storms and the storms obey. And when we begin to remember this, we can't help but have peace. Because when we remember who's in control and that we serve a God who's with us, it changes everything. So the question is, as we bring this thing to a close today, the question that I want to ask is, what do we do with this? It's nice to sit here on a Sunday morning and hear, some Bible verses and some good thoughts. That's great. But what do we actually do with this when we leave? When tomorrow we step back into the craziness, we step back into the stress, we step back into the anxiety. What do we do? How do we begin to invite more of God's peace and his presence in our lives? And I love it because the Apostle Paul, he actually gave us a really great roadmap for this in the scriptures. And he gave us a really great plan that we can actually begin to practice. And it's really simple and it's really easy. And I thought I would share this with you as we begin to close today. And this is what he says in Philippians chapter 4 and how we can begin to put this into practice. He says this, he says, don't worry about anything, but instead pray about everything. Tell God what you need and thank him for all he has done, and then you will experience God's peace, which exceeds anything we can understand. His peace will guard your hearts and minds as you live in Christ Jesus. See, I love this because he says, you can experience God's peace, which exceeds anything you can understand. In other words, we can experience the peace of God, so much peace that we can't even wrap our heads around it. Like in the moments where we should be stressed out, where we should be overwhelmed, when we should be freaking out, in those moments where life gets so crazy, he says that, you know what? You can experience a peace that exceeds any of those things. Why? If you'll just do this, if you'll just learn to practice this, don't worry about anything, but instead pray about everything. That's it. He says, if you can do this, you can experience a peace that surpasses understanding. You can have God's peace with you in any storm, any circumstance, any problem, any time that life just happens. Now, this is so simple, and there's a really important word I want you guys to see here. It says, don't worry about anything. Instead, this is key, pray about everything. And this word is key here because this word means it's an either or proposition. It means you can do one or the other, but you can't do both. You could say this word instead, it means to substitute. In other words, you can't pray and worry at the same time. You got to pick. He says if you can get this, you can have a peace that rather, instead of worrying, begin to pray. It's crucial. And here's the thing. If you're good at worrying like I am sometimes, you're going to be great at praying, okay? 'Cause I don't know about you, but I'm really great at worrying. But prayer and worry are the same thing, really, because worry is this. Worry is just meditating on the problem, right? We're meditating on all the things that went wrong and all the what ifs and what could happen. And prayer is just the opposite. Instead of meditating on the problem, prayer is meditating on the solution, on the one who's really in control, on the one who has the power to change your circumstance. That's what prayer is. And you can choose, am I going to pray about this or am I going to worry about this? And Paul even goes on to say, he says, you know what? Instead of just worrying about it, why don't you take that energy and remind yourself of who's really in control and begin to bring it to God and invite his peace in and his presence in, because peace, remember, it's not the absence of problems. It's not the absence of the storm, but peace is God's presence. And when you tell him what you need, you're actually inviting his presence in that moment. And then he even goes on to say, here's how you should pray. It's really simple. He says, just tell God what you need and thank him for all that he's done. So that's it. Simple. Tell God what you need and thank him for all he's done. You say, why? Because as you're telling God what you need, you're inviting his presence in, because you're saying, God, here's what's going on. Here's my problem. Here's the storm. Here's the thing. God, I need your help. Would you come? Would you give me your peace? And you're inviting his peace in and his presence in. And remember, peace is the presence of God. And then when you thank him for all he's done, what you're doing when you thank him for what God's done for you is you're actually reminding yourself of who's really in control. Because you're reminding yourself, saying, God, thank you so much for the last time that you came through. God, thank you that you're with me. God, thank you that you came through for this person. And as you pray, you're reinforcing your faith and you're saying, God, you're in control. And I put my trust and my confidence in that more than my circumstance. And as you begin to do this, as you begin to realize that God is with you and he's in control, you can't help but begin to have a supernatural peace and begin to walk out looking more like Jesus. So as we close today and bring this thing to an end, my challenge for you is really simple this week. I just want us as a church to give this a try, this verse, and I want us to begin to put this into practice. And for the next 7 days, I want to challenge you that when you wake up in the morning, the first thing you do is just pray that little prayer. Just tell God what you need and thank him for what he's done. That's it. It doesn't have to be extravagant. It doesn't have to be a long prayer. But first thing in the morning, before you do anything in your day this week, for the next week, just try it for 7 days. Just wake up in the morning and say, God, here's what I need today. Here's what I'm going through today. Here's what I'm afraid of. Here's what I'm excited about. And just let God in and invite his presence into your day. And then thank him for what he's done and say, God, thank you so much that you were with me yesterday. God, thanks that I got to have that conversation, whatever that is. And just try that for the next 7 days, first thing in the morning, and watch as God begins to give you a peace. And this week, when some of you go back to work or whatever it is, and something out of the blue comes up and you're nervous, you're scared, you're stressed out, when you have one of those moments, a storm this week, I just want to challenge you that instead of worrying about it, instead of freaking out, just stop right where you're at and just say a little prayer to yourself. Say, God, I need your help in this moment. And tell God what you need and thank him for what he's done, and you can experience his peace. So here's how we're going to end. We're going to sing one final song together. So I want to invite everyone to stand with me, and we're going to stand together. We're going to sing this last song. But before we do that, I just want to acknowledge that I realize that there are some of you in the room who you walked in today on a Sunday morning, and if you were being honest, you would say, you know what, Steve, peace probably isn't a word that I would use to describe my life right now. Maybe you walked in today and things have been challenging and hard and frustrating, and you carried some burdens in here, and your life has been stressed out, and you've even been having a hard time sleeping. I just want you to know that you can walk out of here today with a supernatural peace if you'll begin to put this into practice right here, right now. That if you'll just invite God in the middle of your circumstances, and right before we even leave today, we're going to be here 5 more minutes before we leave. If you just say, God, I need your help, and you tell God what you need, and you thank him for what he's done, God can begin to infuse you with his peace right here, right now. It says in the scriptures that we serve a God who we can cast our cares on. We can give him our burdens, and it says his burden is light. That, in other words, he loves to give you peace. He loves to fill you with joy. And even if the problem doesn't change, even if the circumstances don't change, God says he will be with you, and he'll give you the strength to endure if we'll remember that his presence is with us and that he's in control. So if that's you, if you're in this place and you say, you know what, things have been hard this week, it's been a crazy week, I just want to invite you, as we sing this last song, I'm not going to make you do anything, but I just want to invite you right where you're at. Just say that prayer to yourself. Just tell God what you need and thank him for what he's done, and watch as he begins to give you a peace that surpasses all understanding, even this morning. And take this as a moment to say, God, give me your presence, and I trust that you're in control. And if you will do that, today could be a special, significant day for you. So for the rest of us, let me pray. We're going to sing this last song, and then we'll end our time together. Lord, I thank you so much that you are a God who controls everything. I thank you that you're a God that you hold the whole world in your hands, and yet you say you're with us and you're for us. And so this morning, God, we just want to surrender and submit to you, because we know, God, that if you're with us and you're for us, who can be against us? There's no circumstance that's too big for you, God. There's no problem that's too great for you. There's no issue that you can't overcome. And I pray that you would infuse us this morning with your strength and with your peace as we thank you for who you are and what you've done. God, I pray right now for those who are in this room right now, God, with burdens and pain, and they're in the middle of a season of a storm. God, I pray that you would bring them peace in the middle of the storm in the name of Jesus. I pray that you would begin to bring solutions to problems that they thought there wasn't solutions for. God, I pray that you begin to work supernaturally on their behalf as they say, God, we invite you into this. We need your help. So would you do this morning, God, what only you can do, and would you give us your peace as we worship you one last time, God? We love you. In your name, amen. Let's sing together.